Good day everyone, I'm Mariana Francine Armanahan from PSHM 1B, your speaker for today, and we're going to talk about the declaration of martial law in 1972 by Ferdinand Marcos Sr. When you hear martial law, ano ang mga naiisip or idea na pumapasok sa isip mo? What do you know about martial law? Sino ang nasa likod or ang nag-declare nito? And what's the purpose of martial law? Martial law involves the temporary substitution of military authority for civilian rule and is usually involved in time of war, rebellion, or natural disaster. When martial law is in effect, the military commander of an area or country has unlimited authority to make and enforce law. The law administered by military forces that is invoked by a government in an emergency when the civilian law enforcement agency are unavailable to maintain public order or safety. Under the current Constitution of the Philippines, the President, as head of the state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, may declare martial law in case of invasion or rebellion when the public safety requires it. Most countries use a different legal construct like state of emergency. Martial law has historically been implemented through the armed forces of the Philippines and its predecessors' bodies serving as the head of the state's primary tool for implementing political power in a reversal of the normal practice of civilian control of the military. Do you have any idea who first declared martial law in the Philippines? Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Ferdinand Emmanuel Ederlin Marcos Sr. was a Filipino politician, lawyer, dictator, and kleptocrat who was the 10th President of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986. He ruled under martial law from 1972 until 1981 and kept most of his martial law powers until he was deposed in 1986. Branding his rule as constitutional authoritarianism under his Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, or we also known as New Society Movement. One of the most controversial leaders of the 20th century, Marcos' rule was infamous for its corruption, extravagance, and brutality. September 21, 1972 became the official date that martial law has established and the day that Marcos' dictatorship began. This also allowed Marcos to control history at 7:17 p.m. On September 23, 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos announced on television that he had placed the entirety of the Philippines under martial law. This marked the beginning of a 14-year period of one-man rule that would effectively last until Marcos was exiled from the country on February 25, 1986. Even though formal document proclaiming martial law, Proclamation Number 1081, which was dated September 21, 1972, was formally lifted on January 17, 1981. Marcos retained essentially all of his powers as dictator until he was ousted. While the period of Philippine history in which Marcos was in power actually began 7 years earlier, when he was first inaugurated President of the Philippines in late 1965, and the period in which he continued to wield the powers despite technically lifting the proclamation of martial law in 1981. When Marcos declared martial law in 1972, Marcos claimed that he had done so in response to the communist threat posed by the newly founded Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, and sectarian rebellion of the Mindanao Independence Movement. Opposition figures of the time such as Lorenzo Tañada, Jose Diokno, and Jovito Salonga accused Marcos of exaggerating these threats, using them as convenient excuse to consolidate power and extend his tenure beyond 2 presidential terms allowed by the 1935 Constitution. After Marcos was ousted, government investigators discovered that the declaration of martial law has also allowed the Marcoses to hide secret stashes of unexplained wealth that various courts later determined to be of criminal origin. This 14-year period in Philippine history is remembered for the administration's record of human rights abuses, particularly targeting political opponents, student activists, journalists, religious workers, farmers, and others who fought against the Marcos dictatorship. Based on the documentation of Amnesty International, Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, and similar human rights monitoring entities, historians believe that the Marcos dictatorship was marked by 3,257 known extrajudicial killings, 35,000 documented tortures, 77 disappeared, and 70,000 incarcerations. Explanation of martial law, first in official justification. In his 1987 treatise, Dictatorship and Martial Law, Philippine Authoritarianism in 1972, University of the Philippines Public Administration Professor Alex Brillantes Jr. identifies 3 reasons expressed by the Marcos administration, saying that martial law was a response to various leftist and rightist plots against the Marcos administration and was just the consequence of political decay after American-style democracy failed to take root in Philippine society and was a reflection of Filipino society's history of authoritarianism and supposed need for iron-fisted leadership. Second is political mainstream. Opposition to Marcos' declaration of martial law ran the whole gamut of Philippine society, ranging from impoverished peasants whom the administration tried to chase out of their homes, to the Philippines' political old guard, whom Marcos had tried to displace from power, to academics and economists who disagreed with the specifics of Marcos' martial law policies. All of these, regardless of their social position or policy beliefs, subscribed to the interpretation that Marcos declared martial law as a strategy to enable Ferdinand Marcos to stay in power past the 2 presidential terms allowed him under Philippine Constitution of 1935, and as a technique for covering up the ill-gotten wealth of Marcos, his family, and his cronies. And last, economic interpretation. In addition, some critics who ascribe an economic component to Marcos' motivations, suggesting that martial law was an acquiescence to the global market system, which required tight control of socio-political systems so that the country's resources could be exploited efficiently, was a product of infighting among the families that formed the upper socio-economic class of Philippine society, and a connivance between the state powers and upper-class families to keep the members of the country's lower classes from becoming too powerful. Announcement and implementation of martial law. September 22, 1972 marked a brief period in which Proclamation No. 1081 was formally in place, but without the knowledge of the public. For most of the Philippines, therefore, the martial law was thus properly implemented when it was announced on the evening of September 23, 1972. The implementation of martial law began sometime before midnight on September 22, with the arrest of the 2 main opposition leaders, Ninoy Aquino, who on September 21 held a Congress speech to denounce impending martial law, and Jose Diokno, who held a rally with 50,000 people from the movement of concerned citizens from civil liberties at Plaza Miranda on the same day. By dawn of the following day, many of the 400 individuals listed on the military priority listed, journalists, members of the political opposition, Constitutional Convention delegates, outspoken lawyers, teachers, and students had been detained. Soon after, Congress was abolished, mass activities were prohibited, political parties were outlawed, a curfew was put in place, and civil and political rights were suspended. The first wave of arrests under Marcos' declaration of martial law began with the arrest of Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. late in the evening of September 22 during a late meeting of the Joint Congressional Committee of Tariff Reforms at the Manila Hilton Hotel. Aquino was one of Marcos' most prominent critics and had exposed the plan to proclaim martial law in speech in the Philippine Senate the week before. The arrest of others took place after midnight in the early morning hours of September 23. Martial law forces were sent out to arrest 400 individuals on their priority target list. By the dawn of September 23, 100 of the 400 individuals on the list were in detention centers with detainees. Media lockdown. Marcos reacted with fear of deposition and immediately finalized Proclamation No. 1081, which declared nationwide martial law at 8 p.m. later that evening, one day before the proclamation of September 22, 1972 at 8 p.m. By the morning of September 23, 1972, martial law forces had successfully implemented a media lockdown. When Press Secretary Francisco Tatad went on air to read Proclamation on number 1081, through which Marcos declared martial law, Ferdinand Marcos himself went on air at 7:17 that evening to formalize the announcement. On the following morning, September 24, the headline of Benedicto's Daily Express announced FM declares martial law. The only national newspaper to come out in the middle of aftermath of martial law. The declaration shut down 7 television stations, 16 national daily newspapers, 11 weekly magazines, 66 community newspapers, and 292 radio stations, as well as public utilities such as Meralco, PLDT, and the 3 then existing Philippine Airlines. Here are some pictures taken during the martial law in 1972. This document wants to convey the event when Ferdinand Marcos Sr. is currently declaring martial law. I did my own research to make this PowerPoint presentation using the online platform, and I will include the links I use at the end of this presentation. Wikipedia is my source of information. I tried to find out who is the author of this article, but I failed. I think these are only a secondary source because Wikipedia is an international article and is not based in our country where martial law took place.